Imagine your wedding night, nervous, intimate, but half the village is watching. In medieval Europe, privacy ended at the altar. Even love was a public matter. Today you'll learn how medieval weddings were arranged, what shocking rituals shaped the first night, and which traditions still echo in modern marriage ceremonies. Dear viewers, my big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel. If you subscribe, I'll keep creating even more fascinating and unique videos about life in the Middle Ages. And with your support, we'll get closer to that goal. I'm truly grateful to everyone who's helped me along the way. Now, let's move into today's video. In the medieval imagination, marriage was never a private romance. It was an institution designed to hold society together by binding bloodlines, forging political alliances, and transferring property across generations. While modern weddings often celebrate emotional connection, medieval unions placed sentiment behind structure. A marriage was not a culmination of love, but its substitute, a formal agreement, sealed by custom, law, and, increasingly, the hand of God. At the dawn of the Middle Ages, long before wedding bells echoed in stone chapels, marriage was shockingly informal. A couple needed no priest, no witnesses, no church, just mutual consent, often exchanged in a field, beside a well, or even on a village pathway. A man and a woman simply had to say yes. If they did so publicly, or even in private, and then shared a bed, their union was considered legitimate by both custom and community. In many cases, however, the act itself preceded any verbal promise. One night of passion, if entered into willingly, could bind a couple for life. For women especially, this was irreversible. Once her virginity was lost, her honor became inseparable from her partner's willingness to accept responsibility. If the man declined, her reputation collapsed, and marriage to another became nearly impossible. Such was the brutal arithmetic of medieval morality. Among peasants, marriage could grow from affection or convenience, but among nobles, the stakes were too high to leave to chance. For the landowning elite, marriage was political infrastructure. A union could settle disputes, unite rival houses, or secure the inheritance of territory. Families arranged matches as early as infancy, betrothals inked with seals, while one or both children were still in cradles. In these high-born households, the child's heart was not consulted, only their dowry. For lower classes, consent was still required, but limitations loomed. Serfs, for instance, often needed their lord's permission to marry, especially if they intended to relocate or unite with someone from another estate. The feudal system treated their unions as part of the wider economy. Love, when it appeared, was a fortunate accident. Customs also shifted drastically from region to region. What was law in one duchy could be taboo in the next. In some places, wedding traditions preserved ancient pagan symbols of fertility and protection. In others, ecclesiastical pressure stamped out folk rituals and replaced them with Latin blessings and canonical formulas. Yet across all of Europe, one truth remained: marriage was too important to be left to personal whim. Over time, these loose frameworks tightened. As church authority grew stronger in the 12th and 13th centuries, informal unions fell out of favor. Clergy pushed for public ceremonies, clear declarations of intent, and the formalization of marital consent before a spiritual witness. By the year 1215, the Church declared marriage a sacrament, no longer merely a social bond, but a divine covenant. This shift would change not only the structure of weddings, but the very meaning of love and duty in medieval life. Still, in those early centuries, the simplicity of marriage could trap the unwary. A youthful couple swept up in lust might awaken to discover themselves husband and wife, their fate sealed not by vows, but by impulse. A morning regret had no legal power to undo a night's surrender. In some tales, a man woke with shock to find he was now a husband, and the woman beside him had every right to demand he act like one. Such was the beginning of countless medieval marriages, not with rings or roses, but with necessity, pressure, and the iron weight of social expectation. The journey to the altar, if it came at all, was secondary. The moment of binding came long before, in hidden meadows, silent agreements, or the rustle of straw behind a barn door. And yet, even in this grim calculus of honor and inheritance, there were embers of hope. A few defied tradition, eloped for love, or transformed arranged unions into something warmer with time. By the 13th century, the careless murmur of two lovers agreeing to marry beneath a tree was no longer enough. What had once been a private arrangement governed by custom and local habit became a matter of divine record. In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, the Catholic Church formally declared marriage one of the seven holy sacraments, a profound transformation that reached deep into the lives of peasants and nobles alike, reshaping every step of courtship, union, and separation. Where once a whisper and a night together sealed the deal, the Church now required public rituals, fixed formulas, and official witnesses. The goal was not merely to add solemnity, but to wrest control from folk traditions and impose a unified theological structure over a deeply human institution. A priest's presence became essential, not only to sanctify the bond, but to confirm its legitimacy in the eyes of both heaven and man. No longer was marriage a handshake under the stars. It was a ceremony performed beneath vaulted ceilings, spoken aloud in Latin, and punctuated by holy blessing. With this shift came a tangle of rules and formalities. Couples were now required to publish their intent to marry through banns, public announcements made on 3 consecutive Sundays in church. This practice aimed to uncover hidden obstacles, prior vows, blood relations too close for comfort, or other secrets that could void a union. These preemptive safeguards granted the Church oversight, ensuring that marriage did not violate canon law, however benign the lover's intentions may have seemed. Symbolism also hardened into tradition. Though gifts had long accompanied engagements, sometimes a handful of coins, a woven ribbon, or a shared cup of wine, rings began to emerge as the dominant token of promise. Their circular shape, unbroken and eternal, appealed to ecclesiastical ideals of divine union. A simple band, often of modest metal, came to represent not just love, but eternity. Over time, this practice spread across all classes, from noble halls to peasant cottages. The role of witnesses, too, grew in stature. They were no longer casual friends or family, but vital guarantors of legitimacy, expected to testify if disputes arose. Witnesses remained essential not only during the vows, but even after the ceremony, particularly in verifying the consummation of the marriage, which, without physical union, was considered spiritually incomplete. Thus, the private acts of lovers were drawn increasingly into the public eye, folded into layers of doctrine, law, and social surveillance. This expanding religious authority brought with it another weighty consequence: the near eradication of divorce. As a sacrament, marriage became indivisible. Once declared, it could not be broken, only annulled, a process that did not end a union but declared it never valid in the first place. Grounds for annulment were narrow: close kinship unknown at the time of marriage, impotence, or lack of consummation. Even these rare exits required evidence, testimony, and usually the intervention of a bishop, if not the Pope himself. For most, once joined, the knot would never be untied. In a world where inheritance determined power and legitimacy shaped the fate of kingdoms, the Church's tightening grip on marriage served both spiritual and political ends. It curtailed clandestine unions, stifled alliances forged in secret, and centralized control over who could marry, when, and under what terms. Parents could still arrange marriages, but those marriages now had to pass beneath the Church's gaze. Even if the bride and groom had never met before the day of the wedding, they would still be required to stand together and declare their consent aloud, voluntarily, in theory. But beneath the marble arches and incense clouds, the pressure to conform remained immense. Young women, in particular, found little freedom in the requirement of consent. To say no at the altar was unthinkable. Families, wealth, and futures balanced on that whispered yes. And yet the Church's insistence on spoken approval, however symbolic, offered a flicker of protection. A marriage made by force, without even that ritual agreement, could be declared invalid, a small but significant shield for the vulnerable. Through these reforms, the Church recast marriage not as a flexible contract, but as a sacred bond, monitored from courtship to death. It did not eliminate love, nor did it erase tradition, but it overlaid them with Latin scripture and ecclesiastical law, transforming the human act of union into a theological cornerstone of Christian life. As these changes rippled across Europe, nobles and peasants alike found themselves swept into a world where marriage was no longer just about families or futures. It was about salvation, too, and with that came both power and peril. In the vaulted halls of aristocratic power, marriage was never merely a personal milestone. It was a calculated move in a larger game of inheritance, diplomacy, and control. For the medieval nobility, love was a rare indulgence, often discouraged, occasionally punished, and almost never a prerequisite for the marital bond. Instead, every union served a purpose, often defined long before the bride could speak or the groom could walk. A noble marriage was less the meeting of hearts than the sealing of treaties. Among the ruling classes, childhood was not a time of innocence, but a stage of strategic positioning. Betrothals were drafted by scribes, sanctioned by notaries, and formalized in documents that detailed land exchanges, dowry amounts, and contingency plans in case of premature death. Infants were promised to one another before they had uttered their first words, and these promises carried the full weight of obligation. By the time such children met, often for the first time on their wedding day, their futures had already been carved in stone. The dowry was central to this exchange, not simply as a gift, but as a financial and political instrument. A daughter's worth was tallied in acres, livestock, silver, and fortified holdings. Some dowries included trunks filled with silks and jewels. Others transferred entire villages or castles from one family's dominion to another. This infusion of wealth into the husband's household symbolized the bride's value, but also served as a safety net, should she be widowed. In response, the groom's family offered the mourning gift, a symbolic return of wealth in the form of land, coin, or possessions, signaling both gratitude and commitment. Despite these ceremonial balances, the weight of choice rested with the families, not the couple. Parents orchestrated these alliances with cold efficiency, often focusing more on feuds and borders than compatibility or affection. A marriage might bring peace to warring houses, solidify loyalty to the crown, or secure a bloodline threatened by dwindling heirs. Whether the pair shared a language, belief, or even a glance before the ceremony mattered little. They were pawns in dynastic ambitions far larger than themselves. Some matches were so premature they bordered on the surreal. The union of young Charles IV, future King of Bohemia and Holy Roman Emperor, with 11-year-old Blanche of Valois took place when he was just 7. The wedding was ceremonial, approved by the Pope himself, with full intent that consummation would follow in adolescence. Their childhood was spent apart, raised separately until the time came to fulfill the final requirements of marriage. Such arrangements, however extraordinary they may seem today, were considered routine among European courts. With such high stakes, these weddings demanded spectacle. The ceremonies unfolded in cathedrals draped in tapestries and lined with nobles and clergy, under the eyes of bishops or even monarchs. The bride, cloaked in layers of embroidered silk, was often no more than a girl, her hands trembling beneath the weight of gold and obligation. The groom, armored in symbols of his house, stood solemnly beside her. Even the arrangement of their bodies held meaning. He stood to her right so that his sword hand remained free, an unspoken reminder that danger might still strike. even at the altar. For threats were real. The richer the bride, the greater the risk of abduction. Rivals might intercept the wedding procession, seeking to force their own marriage and claim her dowry through coercion. In response, noble grooms appointed their most loyal warriors as wedding witnesses, not for show, but as bodyguards. These men stood armed and alert throughout the ceremony, shielding the couple from interruption. This custom, rooted in deadly seriousness, echoes faintly in the modern tradition of the best man. Though such marriages rarely began with love, affection was not impossible. Time, shared trials, and the gradual erosion of unfamiliarity could warm even the coldest matches. Yet the expectation remained unchanged, duty above all. If a wife failed to bear sons, or a husband failed to defend his title, the consequences rippled through courts and bloodlines. Failure to proceed with the match, on the other hand, was nearly unthinkable. A broken betrothal could incite war, invite shame, or invoke massive penalties. Once pledged, there was no easy retreat. Only through annulment, granted by high ecclesiastical courts under narrow conditions, could noble families escape entanglements no longer politically convenient. And even then, the process demanded years, testimony, and papal intervention. Thus, among the nobility, marriage was a ceremony of masks and obligations, a public alignment of fortunes cloaked in the guise of personal union. A noble wedding in medieval Europe was never just a union between two individuals. It was a declaration of power, an exhibition of wealth, and a theatrical affirmation of a family's influence. These ceremonies, often months in preparation, unfolded not as quiet spiritual moments, but as grand spectacles choreographed with precision, intent on impressing allies, intimidating rivals, and binding entire dynasties under gilded banners. Every detail, from the bride's hem to the feast's final toast, was saturated with meaning. The timing of such events was rarely left to whim. Astrologers were often consulted to determine the most auspicious date, while chroniclers recorded the chosen day as a milestone in a family's legacy. When that moment arrived, the surrounding towns and countryside pulsed with anticipation. Guests descended in processions, lords and ladies in furs and brocade, priests in embroidered vestments, and knights in crested armor, each one a testament to the prestige of the occasion. Ceremonies typically took place in cathedrals or abbeys, where the scent of incense mingled with candle smoke beneath vaulted ceilings. Altars were adorned with fresh flowers and relics, while choirs rehearsed sacred hymns that would accompany the vows. The groom arrived first, flanked by his heralds and armed companions, standing tall beneath the gaze of saints carved in stone. Positioned to the left of his bride, he kept his sword hand free, not out of tradition alone, but out of caution, for the memory of bridal abductions lingered even within consecrated walls. The bride followed in carefully orchestrated procession, her gown a masterpiece of artistry and meaning. In an age before white symbolized purity, she wore brilliant shades of crimson, green, or deep blue, colors representing fertility, luck, or Marian devotion. The finest fabrics were reserved for this moment: Italian silk, damask woven with silver thread, or velvets imported at great cost. Jewels, sometimes inherited from generations past, glistened on her neckline and wrists, while her hair, unbound or braided with ribbons, carried the last symbols of her maidenhood. Around her waist, a richly embroidered belt marked her as the bearer of future heirs, a sacred and practical emblem of her role. At the altar, vows were exchanged before the priest and a sea of witnesses. The ceremony, though rigid in its canonical structure, shimmered with pageantry. Prayers invoked divine blessing, rings changed hands, and veils were lifted not only to reveal faces, but to unveil a family's future. When the priest gave his final benediction, a new alliance stood before the congregation, sealed by word, wealth, and sacrament. But the true celebration began only after the blessing. Outside the church, horns blared, drums rolled, and the wedding procession transformed into a festival of noble identity. Often, a jousting tournament was held in honor of the newlyweds, with knights competing for glory, beneath pennants bearing family crests. The spectacle was not merely entertainment, it was homage, a martial chorus proclaiming that the bond between two houses was now protected by strength and valor. The banquet that followed was as lavish as the vows themselves. In great halls draped with tapestries, guests were seated in order of rank, with golden plates, goblets of carved horn, and trenchers laid across linen-draped tables. Roasted boar and spiced venison shared space with stuffed peacocks, their feathers reattached and gilded for dramatic effect. Exotic ingredients such as cinnamon, saffron, and cloves, brought from distant markets, perfumed the air and signaled the family's wealth. Entire animals were sculpted into fantastical forms, and towering pies revealed live birds or musicians hidden within, to the astonishment of the crowd. Wine flowed freely, often imported in barrels from France or Italy, while mead and ale, brewed in monastic cellars, kept commoners and clergy alike in high spirits. As goblets were emptied and toasts proclaimed, musicians filled the hall with the sound of lutes, shawms, and drums. Storytellers, jesters, and troubadours spun tales of chivalry and courtly love, blending myth with memory, binding guests to the narrative of the day. A peculiar tradition sometimes unfolded as the couple approached their table, a tower of sweet cakes stacked high. If they managed to kiss over the precarious pile without knocking it down, it was believed that abundance would grace their union. Though whimsical in appearance, this ritual echoed deeper hopes for fertility and prosperity, and eventually gave rise to the layered wedding cakes of later centuries. These celebrations could stretch for days, particularly among royalty, where hundreds, sometimes thousands of guests needed housing, meals, and diversions. Chronicles recount weddings that emptied treasuries and strained alliances, but none dared skimp on splendor. A wedding poorly staged could be interpreted as weakness. One conducted with magnificence confirmed the family's unassailable place in the social order. Within all this spectacle, the bride and groom were both honored and obscured. Though their hands were joined and their names inscribed in the genealogies, the day belonged just as much to their families, their guests, and the legacy they were expected to uphold. Even moments of tenderness, shared glances, tentative smiles, unfolded under scrutiny, each gesture a performance in a ritual designed for kings and chronicles. Far from the stone cathedrals and jeweled halls of the nobility, marriage among common folk unfolded on humbler ground, but with no less care, meaning, or joy. For peasants, craftsmen, and town dwellers, the wedding was not a performance for power, but a communal rite, a rare moment when toil gave way to song, when everyday hardship paused for a few brief hours of celebration. Though lacking gold-threaded gowns or tournaments in honor of dynasties, these weddings were rich with intimacy, grounded in practicality, and shaped by deep-rooted tradition. The timing of such ceremonies was dictated less by astrology than by agricultural necessity. Marriages were commonly arranged after the harvest, in late autumn or deep winter, when fields rested and granaries were full. November and February, in particular, were favored months, cold, quiet seasons when food could be spared and labor briefly eased. Spring and summer weddings were rare, not out of sentiment, but survival. Those were months of planting, reaping, and relentless work. In some regions, a May wedding was avoided entirely, burdened with the ominous rhyme, "Marry in May, rue the day." Unlike nobles, village couples often knew one another from childhood, having shared the same lanes, markets, and seasonal feasts. Courtship, while bounded by social norms and parental influence, allowed room for affection to grow. Still, considerations of property, skills, and stability loomed large. A daughter might bring into marriage a dowry of blankets, a cow, or a patch of soil. A groom, in turn, was expected to prove his ability to work, to build, and to provide. If a family lacked coin or goods, the bride or groom might enter the service of their in-laws for a year or more, laboring to earn their partner through effort rather than wealth. The ceremony itself was usually held in the local parish church, a simple structure of wood or fieldstone where the priest, known to all in the village, led the couple through their vows. These weddings lacked choirs or organ music. Their power lay in familiarity and shared meaning. The bride, standing to the groom's right so that his sword hand, symbolic even if he owned no blade, remained free, wore her best clothing, often the same outfit she used on Sundays. Wealthier families might afford dyed fabrics or modest embroidery, but most brides entered marriage in earth-toned garments, brown, gray, beige, colors chosen for durability rather than display. Yet amid these muted hues, the bride's wreath stood out vividly. Woven from herbs, green branches, and fresh flowers, the crown symbolized purity and youth. It was not merely decoration, it was a declaration. Girls who wore the wreath signaled virginity, a tradition so powerful that its removal marked the transition into womanhood. During or just after the ceremony, the bride's wreath was often taken away and replaced with a scarf or cap, a gesture that evoked both celebration and loss. More than one young woman is said to have wept in that moment, realizing that her childhood had truly ended. After the church bells ceased and the prayers faded, the village transformed. The newlyweds might be paraded through the streets in a decorated cart or walk arm in arm as neighbors tossed grains of wheat or rye beneath their feet, a rustic blessing for fertility and abundance. In some regions, guests flung handfuls of walnuts or almonds, their hard shells and sweet cores meant to mirror the trials and rewards of married life. Such customs, preserved and adapted through centuries, live on in modern gestures like scattering rice or flower petals. The wedding feast, hosted in a family home or local tavern, was no less anticipated than the vows themselves. Though lacking swans or spices from the East, these meals overflowed with generosity. Families and neighbors pooled their stores: bread, cabbage, sausages, smoked pork, stews rich with root vegetables and herbs. Homemade beer flowed from wooden barrels, and clay pitchers of honeyed mead passed from hand to hand. Guests sat on benches, huddled close beneath timbered ceilings, their laughter rising with the steam of the cooking hearth. Music came not from trained minstrels, but from within the crowd. A fiddle, bagpipe, or simple drum set the rhythm, and voices joined in old songs passed down like heirlooms. The dances were circular, communal, no elegant waltz or courtly bow, just stamping feet, clasped hands, and the swirl of skirts near the fire. There were games, too: playful ransom for the bride's shoe, the breaking of a dish for luck, or the symbolic sweeping of pottery shards by the couple to show they could build a life together, one piece at a time. As the final cup was drained and the last dance faded into laughter, the medieval wedding did not quietly recede into privacy. On the contrary, what followed was perhaps the most harrowing and publicly charged moment of the entire event. The wedding night, romanticized today as a private celebration of intimacy, was, for many in the Middle Ages, a deeply intrusive ordeal marked by expectation, surveillance, and, at times, humiliation. In a world where inheritance depended on legitimacy and purity was measured with scrutiny, the consummation of a marriage became not a private act, but a public concern. The newlyweds were seldom left to themselves. In noble households especially, the transition to married life unfolded under watchful eyes. After the banquet, relatives, guests, clergy, or appointed elders would escort the bride and groom to the bedchamber, not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a duty. In certain traditions, a priest blessed the marriage bed, prayed over the couple, and, in some cases, symbolically tucked them under the covers. This blessing was not symbolic alone. It was an official marker that the union had crossed from promise into fulfillment. Among the aristocracy, additional layers of inspection added to the pressure. A retinue of matrons, experienced women of the family, or trusted midwives, might examine the bride before the act to confirm her virginity. This practice, humiliating and steeped in patriarchal obsession with purity, was intended to prevent future disputes over legitimacy. A nobleman, after all, could not afford questions regarding the bloodline of his future heirs. Even royalty was not exempt. Historical accounts claim that Elishka Przemyslovna, Bohemian princess and future queen, was subjected to such an inspection before her marriage to John of Luxembourg. Once the chamber was sealed, the performance did not end. Walls were thin. Guests often lingered nearby, listening for signs that the marriage had been properly consummated. In some households, proof was required, most notoriously the display of bloodied bed linens as evidence of the bride's virginity and the couple's physical union. These grim tokens were paraded before family, or hung from windows, their presence confirming not just passion but legality. Should the sheets remain unstained or silence prevail, shame and speculation would follow. The burden fell especially on the groom. If he failed to perform, whether due to fear, exhaustion, inebriation, or inexperience, the consequences could be severe. Ridicule was immediate. Remedies were proposed, some traditional, others absurd. In certain regions, fertility symbols such as a clucking hen or a baby boy might be placed in the room to encourage results. If failure persisted, the man faced not just embarrassment, but legal jeopardy. In extreme cases, a marriage could be annulled on the grounds of impotence, a claim requiring both testimony and public inquiry. Scenarios that dragged private anguish into public spectacle. Peasant households mirrored these customs in less formal but no less invasive ways. In many villages, neighbors crowded outside the home, singing bawdy songs, clattering pots, or tapping windows, half teasing, half confirming that the rite of passage was underway. Though no bed linens were inspected, the community still expected evidence, or at least affirmation, that the marriage was sealed. The wedding night thus became an extension of the feast, a communal drama with two anxious actors at its center. And yet, beneath the ceremonial absurdities and crude superstitions, there lingered a sincere belief that a marriage incomplete in flesh was incomplete in soul. In a culture where spiritual doctrine and social order were deeply intertwined, the act of consummation carried theological weight. It was not simply an expression of desire, it was the final vow, the bodily signature beneath the sacred contract. Should the union fail in this regard, the path to annulment was opened, but not without difficulty. To dissolve the marriage, one had to prove that consummation never occurred or could never occur. Testimonies were collected, examinations were arranged, and decisions could take months or years. The Church, though insistent on the sanctity of the marital bond, allowed this loophole provided the evidence was sufficient. For the woman, particularly if noble, this process was fraught with risk. Failure to prove her innocence or her husband's incapacity could result in disgrace or exile from the courtly world. Yet when the night unfolded as expected, when awkwardness turned to tenderness, or duty to a tentative affection, another ritual awaited at dawn. The morning gift, presented by the groom to his new wife, served as both a reward and a promise. It could be a ring, a jewel, a parcel of land, or simply a warm cloak. This gift acknowledged the bride's virtue, marked the transition into her new role, and bound the husband further to his obligation. In it, one finds the flicker of sentiment, a glimpse of generosity beneath the weight of formality. Thus ended the most intimate and public moment of the wedding ritual. With the consummation declared, the marriage stood whole before God, law, and community. The couple, now tied in every sense, emerged not only as man and wife, but as agents of continuity in a society where lineage was legacy and where the union of bodies ensured the survival of names, lands, and power. Though centuries now divide the modern world from the one where marriage was inked in bloodlines and bound by law, echoes of the medieval wedding continue to murmur through silk gowns, whispered vows, and lingering customs few recall the origin of. While brides no longer prove their virtue beneath scrutinizing eyes, and grooms are no longer flanked by armored witnesses prepared to draw steel, the architecture of the wedding day, its pageantry, symbols, and expectations, still rests on foundations laid in distant stone halls and wind-swept villages. The most enduring of these relics is the ring. What once was a simple token, a string, a coin, or even a carved splinter of wood exchanged as a promise, gradually evolved into the circle of gold now worn by millions. It was the Church, insisting on visible and binding symbols, that elevated the ring into a central rite. By the 13th century, it had become a common sign of consent, its endless loop signifying fidelity, eternity, and the divine enclosure of the union. The tradition deepened with time, gaining refinement. By the late medieval period, the diamond ring had emerged among royalty and nobility as a mark of wealth and permanence. Even the act of exchanging vows at the altar, now seen as the emotional heart of the modern ceremony, owes its structure and language to the canonical formulas enforced by the medieval Church. The declarations, "I take thee, to have and to hold, for better or worse," are distant children of Latin phrases etched into liturgical handbooks, carefully crafted to establish consent and legitimacy. While today these words often swell with personal feeling, in their origin they served as legal armor against future disputes, protecting property rights and family honor more than romantic ideals. Other rituals, once drenched in symbolism, now appear merely quaint or playful. Throwing rice or petals as the couple departs recalls the grain once scattered in village lanes to invoke fertility and good harvests. The bridal bouquet, now a flourish of color and scent, evolved from earlier bundles of strong-smelling herbs, rosemary, myrtle, rue, carried to ward off misfortune and ill spirits. And the veil, which many modern brides still choose, once served not as mere fashion, but as a spiritual and cultural shield, cloaking the bride from evil eyes or hiding her from a groom she had never seen. Even the honeymoon, imagined now as a tranquil retreat, had its rustic predecessor in Northern Europe. There, newlyweds were gifted a month's supply of mead, a sweet fermented honey wine believed to encourage fertility and soften the anxieties of new intimacy. Hence the phrase honeymoon, born from the mingling of sweetness and the moon's passing cycle, symbolizing both the tenderness and the temporality of early wedded life. Some customs, stripped of their darker roots, survive as games or staged gestures. The mock abduction of the bride, now a comical side event at receptions, harks back to real medieval fears, where noble women could be kidnapped before consummation to sabotage alliances or claim ransoms. Likewise, carrying the bride across the threshold, today a romantic gesture, originated from ancient and medieval beliefs that evil spirits lurked beneath doorways. To shield her from unseen forces and mark her passage into a new role, the groom would lift her, an act of both protection and transition. What has changed, perhaps more than any ritual, is the purpose of the wedding itself. In the medieval world, love was rare, even irrelevant. Marriage was a mechanism for survival, diplomacy, and succession. Affection might come later, or not at all. Today, in much of the world, love stands at the center. Couples marry freely, often after long relationships, and the ceremony becomes not a beginning imposed by family or faith, but a culmination of shared will and sentiment. It is a shift profound and hard-won, the product of centuries of cultural, legal, and theological evolution. Yet even now, as couples script their own vows or marry in forests, gardens, or courthouse halls, the old bones of tradition remain. The white dress, though popularized only in the 19th century by Queen Victoria, evokes echoes of medieval bridal garments stitched for beauty, virtue, and the promise of new beginnings. The reception feast, no matter how modest or grand, reflects the ancestral instinct to gather in joy, to eat, drink, and affirm the union before the eyes of the living and the memory of the dead. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.